speakers, please. Ambassador Amar Sinha, Mr. Claude Harvey.
Good morning. So, without losing any time, I'm very sorry to be here because I think a Chinese friend was supposed to be sitting here and absolutely unable to speak on behalf of China because it's not what I've done the last 2 decades. But I think maybe General Roy could say a few words about what the speaker was supposed to say. Now, I don't know if the organizer have planned it like that, but this session is the day after the budget, and it's on the economy. I think it's the most important, because whatever else we will discuss or we have discussed in the morning, like I think afternoon, Professor Conrad will speak about the PLA and all these different aspects of the India-China relation. If you have no money, that's not going to happen. And today I was reading the paper and there was one title, Honey, where is the money? It's about the budget which the finance minister presented yesterday. Now I would like to go a little bit differently than the previous speaker and just say about China. I think China has also a problem of money. Now today they are investing like in the defense sector, in research, like the quantum communication, they are planning by 2050 10 aircraft carriers. They are doing 2 stealth jets, J-20 and J-31s. And if you look at every sector, they really have completely changed. They have become creative. They are not just doing reverse technology. And all this needs money. Now, my question is, and I don't know, maybe the speaker could say a few words about it, how deep China's pocket is today. And another issue which has come recently after the 19th Congress is also about fake figures. I mean, we all knew about it from the Great Leap Forward, all the fake figures which were coming to the central leadership. And it has been continuing. I think when Mr. Chu Hongji was premier also, he pointed out the fingers several times. He tried to change it, but it's still not changed. Now I think, again in the morning, this morning in Bloomberg, they were saying that this, all the figures are false, and the Inner Mongolia, as well as Liaoning province, had to change 2 days ago their figures. They say 30%. It means also on the GDP, we are speaking of GDP 6.9, but according to Bloomberg today, maybe it's 2 points less. It seems the leadership is aware and is trying very hard to change this, and it's especially serious issue in the provinces. And I remember 2-3 decades ago when Gordon Chang wrote his book about the collapse of China. So everyone was clapping and saying, very good book, and all his arguments were valid, and China is going to collapse. I remember even discussing with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and it was in 1990-91, he said, yes, China is going to collapse in 5 years. And after the end of the 90s, I asked him again, I said, what about the collapse of China? China has not collapsed. I think it means that China are more clever, more intelligent, more flexible than sometimes we think they are. I remember one Chinese president, I think it's Mr. Hu Jintao, coming to India and telling the Communist Party, I think Mr. Yeshuri or someone, you should become flexible if you want to survive. So all this collapse of China's story has showed that China is also flexible, China is able to change. And I think their economy is greatly changing and taking a new direction. One, of course, is the VIR and focusing on project outside China. But I've seen 2-3 days ago, I think there was an article in Chinese press mentioning that 91% of the project on the VIR are subcontracted to Chinese. It's where subcontracted to Chinese contractors. It means that today it's benefiting many. So before passing the mic to the two very eminent speakers on that, just that question of how deep the pockets of China are. And another small other issue is about the transboundary trade. Is maybe many people consider it as negligible, but I think it's important as a confidence building measure. Can it be increased, or will it be again added to the trade deficit? People argue that suppose we open Natura to more items, the trade deficit will increase. But I would like to remember, and those who have been in the army know very well, that the smuggling is flourishing in places like Domchule, and I was told that trade in Domchule sometimes reach on that crores of rupee, while the official trade figures in places like Chipila or Lipopekla is very minimal. It's only a few crores. I think this year Chipila was below 1 crore. So I would like to leave these small issues be mentioned. So I will ask first Ambassador Amashina to speak about the trade deficit.
Good morning, distinguished participants here and the audience. I think the first two sessions made it very clear that China is a country of concern. Even if it's not a threat, it's definitely a challenge. And a challenge in many ways, and I don't want to go over the ground that has already been covered by other speakers, in terms of how it's affecting India's position in the globe. It's affecting its own borders. And of course, we have a direct conflict in terms of China. What is the solution? And the question that was posed to me, whether trade can mitigate this strategic differences that we have with China. There are different ways of looking at it. One thing is clear, that there is a huge asymmetry between India and China. It has grown. China's size of economy is 5 times ours. We have a huge trade deficit, which is $50 or $60 billion today on a total trade of $70 billion. Is it an issue of concern? If we had to look purely from trade angle, I would perhaps say that perhaps not. We have, India actually as a country has lived with this sort of trade imbalances on a few important items. And I think first is oil and natural gas. Our dependence on hydrocarbons, if you look at our import bills, it's close to $100 billion, which must have come down today. Another item of consumption, gold. Alone accounts for nearly 60 billion of unmitigated trade deficit. India has lived with it for a long time. So if you look purely from trade issues, it is not really that you have to have every set of bilateral relations has to have balanced trade. But of course, it affects the domestic manufacturing capacities. It is linked to the capacity to generate employment. How it is affecting that, and that is where it becomes a problem. The fact is, we'll have to accept that China will retain its accumulation of power, both in diplomatic, economic, and military ways. We have a lot to catch up for. But in trade issues, what is it that we can achieve? We have, and I have worked in Commerce Ministry, we have been trying to address this issue of trade. And there are a large number of forums that we have created. First, of course, most important is the Joint Economic Working Group, which is led by the two commerce ministers. Then the Strategic Economic Dialogue, which is led by the Vice Chairman of the NITI Aayog. And a number of working groups on trade issues, whether it's trade and services. We don't agree even on trade statistics, like perhaps in border issues, we don't agree on the length of our borders. So there are major, both perceptual and differences in reality that we have to address. Now the good thing is that we have to learn, perhaps take a leaf out of China's book, how it dealt with US. which today, of course, it is challenging US, but in its long-term vision, it always saw US as the main challenge. But it used US very effectively to get in all the manufacturing. And in fact, the US, in fact, created to this rise of China as a manufacturing hub for the world. So much so that today's China's contribution, and I must say, it is nearly 25% of the global value chain comes from China. Unfortunately, India has remained completely outside of this value chain, for whatever reason. Of course, our trade negotiations always talked about policy space, we need autonomy, well, which we have got for 70 years. What have we done with that space, is the question. The way things are changing today, there are analysts which feel that China has perhaps peaked its economic potential. And because of rising costs, the labor costs are growing up, because of domestic regulation which is making it difficult for the foreign companies to operate in China, that many corporations are looking of moving out. And that is where we feel that there is an opportunity. The good thing in trade is both China, though we have huge competition, both China and India look at each other as an opportunity. And that is interesting. China also accepts our dominance or preeminence in IT services, though it does not allow us a level playing field in its own economy. And that has been a major grounds. In terms of manufacturing, of course, we are unable to compete, and not because something that China is doing. Of course, they have unfair practices in terms of the financing, subsidies, does not necessarily play by the rules, but also because of the inefficiencies that we have created and we have not been able to address, which was very ably addressed by General Roy Chaudhary in the last session. Now, when China is speaking, do we think that the new flying geese model can come to India? And that is what we really need to look and work at in the 10 years that we really have to meet the challenge from China. And one classic example, since they're uniformed officers, this thing that we have to do everything ourselves perhaps has shown worst, and it has put us in the worst light in the defense sector. And when the Prime Minister talks of Make in India, the greatest handicap we see is that our dependence on imported weaponry or weapon systems is as big as our dependence on hydrocarbons. It's nearly 80%. And that is where we will have to really change our policies. We have opened up the FDI in defense, but that is perhaps not sufficient. We have looked at ease of doing business. We have improved, but China is far ahead. It's 25 or 22 slots above us. But what I would say that ease of living is something that India will have to focus on if we have to get in outsiders to come in. And when I say ease of living business, it means that India should not be seen as a hardship posting. We will have to look at pollution, waste management, better school education for people who come and live and work here, easier movement of people, and of course the traffic congestion, which people find it impossible. And these are all key factors in decisions when people make that they want to come to India. It is not only how much return they can get. Of course, they all get a reasonable return. In fact, it is a proven fact that the returns on capital invested in India actually fetches them more than what it gets in China. Still, we haven't seen the type of FDI. We are now catching up. We are close to $100 billion against China's $126 billion. But the bigger challenge that we face strategically is the outbound FDI from China. That has reached over $170 billion a year. It actually is $50 billion more than what they receive. And that is creating this imbalance around the world. It is challenging the established economies and of course emerging economies. And the key other difference, when we say, of course, we will have to, and Doklam proved it, that while the border issues were on the back burner, but it has now come up front. And first time, what was different in this was that China went public. It also threatened war and use of force, which had not happened, and we had managed it well. So there is a need to develop a new paradigm, a new modus vivendi with China, while being firm and able to face, and that is of course a challenge for the diplomats and the defense forces, but to create that space where we can actually have cooperation in economy. China has the deepest pockets, $3 trillion of reserves. As I said, 170 billion going out. 100 Chinese companies are already in India, which is a very impressive number. But if you look at what we have actually invested in each other's economy is minimal. China's cumulative investment in India is $3 billion, which is absolutely nothing. It has promised 46 billion in Pakistan. Our investments in China, we have over 80 companies working there, all our pharmaceutical majors, all our IT sector companies are there. They face challenges, but still it's an economy that they cannot stay out of. And their cumulative investments is less than $1 billion. Now, is it part of a policy or is it just accidental is something that analysts will have to look. Why is it that Indians who are perhaps investing much more, even in Africa, our cumulative investments are over $30 billion. In UK, we perhaps invest $10 billion a year. How is it that the China, which is next door, which is the second largest economy in the world, we have fallen so short? And there is a need to get them here interested. And the fact that the absence of this professor who was supposed to come here is only a symptom. It reflects what is wrong. First, we don't know enough of each other. And I think there is also a lack of ability to understand each other. I wish he was here. He could not get a visa. While on one hand, we are trying to attract Chinese tourists. You'll be surprised to know that China is sending out 122 million outbound tourists a year. They spend over $100 billion outside. How many come to India? 200,000. We are immediately next door. I think more Indians will go to China, maybe for businesses or imports, but that's a fact. Yeah, and this number is after we spent last 2 years as year of India and China in 2015 and year of China and India in 2016. That is what led Prime Minister Modi to have an e-visa for businesses, for people, for tourists. Unfortunately, in our own old thinking, conferences still is seen as a major security threat. So experts cannot come to attend conferences, and it has a huge triple layer of approval. You have to have approval from Ministry of External Affairs, from Ministry of Home Affairs, then, of course, then all these letters, the organizers have to send to the concerned consulate, and only then he can get a visa, and obviously this will miss his flight. Despite, of course, our trying to help General Roy. I'm so sorry about that. But I wish he had come, because we would have heard from him how they perceive India. We have heard, a lot of us, what we feel, how China perceives us. Is that important enough? I don't think that's only half the story. We also have to learn from them how they look at India. They, of course, find India a dirty place. In fact, there is a conscious policy to project India as a dirty place. In fact, there were huge hoardings all over China in Beijing when the pollution was the highest in Delhi in 1990. Advertising that India should be avoided because the PM level is 800 and focuses on the weak points. But that was also in the context of the Doklam. It was trying to change the public perception of how the people look at India. So, of course, but how the world looks at us, they see that both of us have had impressive journey. We have, of course, 21st century rise of China is compared to America's rise in 20th century. It's also known that India has lagged behind because of our structural deficiencies, the way we make decisions, our political systems. Perhaps in China, it's what, 25 people or 32 people which actually take all the decisions which you can't have in India. So there are differences, but for us to play it smart, I think we will have to keep highlighting the fact that China needs to play by the rule, provide us equal sort of market access that we provide to them, or else we will have to take reciprocal measures to stop that. And there, the biggest weakness of Indian system has been that we have failed to develop standards. Standards which will, of course, also force Indian companies to manufacture products at a certain level, but then standards are the biggest tool used today in trade to stop things that are unwanted or which you don't want. And the classic example is Indian meat and fruits and vegetables cannot access Chinese market because they have put certain standards which we are unable to match. And despite their having done multiple rounds of inspections, nothing has moved in the last 8 years that I have followed this. We also see that there is a hesitancy on the Chinese sovereign wealth funds are investing in India. They are investing all over the world except India, so maybe it's a state policy. But the fact remains that Asia will not be dominated by China, not because of rise of India, but also because actually the global world is becoming multipolar, which is not to China's liking. It wanted a hierarchical world where it was at the top and the rest paid obeisance to it. But rise of Indonesia, Vietnam, South Korea, India, and this region will make sure that that will not happen. It will be a very important position, but it will not be able to dominate the way perhaps the Western powers dominated in the last century. I think I'm just running out of time. I'll be happy to take questions. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
You have 40 more seconds, but I think, thank you so much for your, I think, John Roy will present the paper. It will be a kind of
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, this is a presentation, rather a bunch of slides sent to me by the slated speaker, Mr. Mohan Guruswamy. Neither do I have the intellect nor his articulation to really go ahead on this issue, but however, I will try and put some flesh onto the various slides that he has sent. No, I'm not intended. Time to go.
It's okay.
Okay.
Some privilege.
No, not at all.
No,
Now let's take this, what is changing in China? China already has a population of 180 million who are over 60 today. And this is set to reach, I'm given to believe by some statistics, but 240 million by 2020 and 360 million by 2030. Now these are minimum numbers, I'm given to believe, which will only increase with rising life expectancy. Its population will, however, remain frozen at 1.3 billion. Should China's current fertility rate of 1.4 children per couple be sustained, the population share of people aged over 60 could reach 20% by 2020 and another say few million by 2030. Now what are the implications of aging? Implications of aging is China's rapidly aging population will have enormous economic and social implications. This is a world workforce projection which gives out, if you look at it very carefully, China's workforce population is decreasing, whereas India's workforce population is increasing from 580 in 2015 to 906 million in 2050. Now the demographic dividend China enjoyed over the past 30 years, especially in 1980 to 2000, is now largely, let's say, exhausted, use the word. In 1980 to 2010, the effect of a favorable population age structure accounted for 15% to 25% per capita GDP growth. So, what we have is a situation that it is, let us say, no more cheap. I would like to flash a few slides about what is happening in the other countries during this season. If you look at it, Japanese population by age group. Look at this thing carefully. They are also increasing, just like China. And by 2040, 1/3 of Japan will be over 65 years of age. We call up to 65 being productive age. Now, let us come back to the GDP. You see, this is how the world stacked up in 2014, and United States leading the pack by far, and India at the third position. For decades, China's economy has been driven by high inputs and low costs of capital and labor. There have been private savings. Most important source of capital investment will decline as the share of GDP over the coming decades. Currently, China has many more net savers than net consumers. By the population share of people 30 to 50, typically, these are the high savers, 30 to 50. These are the high savers, will drop from 50% in 2010 to approximately 46% in 2020 and fall by about 40%, fall to 40% by 2030. Now, when I am seeing these figures, these are the slides that you are seeing, have been sent to me by Mr. Mohan Guruswamy, and I am just adding flesh to what I could gather right and left. Now what happens? Let us see this scenario. A scenario of GDP of China and India by in 2025. Now you see there are 5 scenarios, both in low, both in average, then low China, low India, high China, high India, low China, high India, and high China and low India. Now if you notice, whichever combination option you take, India is far, far below the Chinese pole by 2025. It may change later. Over the next 20 years, the ratio of workers and retirees will drop precipitously from rough 5 to 1 today to 2 to 1. Such a drastic change implies that tax burden for each working age person must rise more than 150% in China, assuming that the government maintains this current level of tax income. I'll go on to the next slide. Now this is IMF GDP forecast 2011 to 2018. If you notice, India is in the 4th position and they have taken the European Union as a whole, which is in the 3rd position. And Japan is just below India. This is supposedly the 2018 GDP forecast of IMF. Now in 1998, for China to grow at its 1 trillion economy by 10%, it had to expand its economic activities by 100 billion and consume only 10% of the world's industrial commodities. The raw materials that included everything from oil to copper and steel. In 2011, to grow its to 5 trillion economy that fast, it needed to expand by 550 billion a year. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not an economist, I am a military man, I am talking from the figures which I could flesh out from somewhere, and suck in more than 30%, Amar will correct me if wherever I go wrong, more than 30% of global commodity production. In 2020, it will need to expand by 1 trillion. Now, let us see the major contributors to the world GDP growth. From 2000 to 2010, we don't have the figures from 2010 to 18. Now, the faster growth rates of China and India imply that the combined GDP at some time will perhaps be able to sink the rest of the world GDP. But before we achieve that, we have to sink our own differences amongst ourselves. Now this is the coming economic transition. Please have a look at the large dark red line where UK goes down from 7th to 10th and US goes down from 1 to 3. China goes up to 1st and India perhaps, if it follows its proper thing, we may go up to 2. But look at the rise at the lines below. Look at Indonesia. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Australia. How their rise is exponential in the economy of the world GDP growth. I mean, coming economic transition. So what does this mean? In spite of everything else, China will remain thrice as rich as India by 2050. The dotted line is Indian growth and the dark top line is Chinese growth. Now we come down to one of the indicative factors of this, say, the prosperity of nations, the spread of middle class. If you see 2015, now middle class, if you look at the yellow, that is the age of 20 to 39, then 20 to 24%, then 25 to 29, the red. You see, India comes in only around 2050, somewhere around the middle class, and catches up. The middle class is the backbone. Middle class forms the backbone of any nation. We just read a few days ago in a newspaper report that only 1% of India's population have garnered about 70% of the wealth. It is hoped that by 2015 things will even out much more, and this is what is supposedly figure that is given. Sorry. Now here is a graph which shows the middle class. Now if you see the 1990 growth of China to 2015, it is tapering down. Whereas from the year 2008 to somewhere 2050, the middle class growth in case of India is growing. So that's a good sign. It's a feel-good factor for all of us who are present over here. And I'm sure there will be better things to come. Now India is, Amar also said about this, touched upon it. India is said to be a next powerhouse of middle class consumption. And consumption, society, we all know the story of USA, it grows. Manufacturing grows, industry grows, everything grows there. Emerging nations and advanced nations. Now this is just a slide of aging Europe. What has happened to Europe? While I showed you that the bulging aging of China, and this was what happened to Europe. What the red line that you see is 1964, and the blue and purple that you see are males and females in 2014. Now here is an important slide. This is China and India population pyramid. 2000 is on the top of this thing and 2035 is the bottom one. If you look at it, the productive force of India would be much more than China around that time, and China would have sort of bulged out with the old age population around 2040 to 2050, 2025 to 2050. Now, why China needs India? Please have a look at this. India had given a services sector 55% to the world in 2007, maybe more now. The contribution of industrial sector was 25.2% and 16.6% as far as the agriculture is concerned. Now if you look at China, as far as the services sector is concerned and as far as the agricultural sector is concerned, in 2007 they were low. Today they are much more though. But they had a much more contribution in the industrial sector. Helped, of course, by USA to a very large extent. So this should make every Indian feel good about it. Now, we are today, by the way, at $50 billion trade. But what was projected some time ago was $100 billion in 2015. This is just to show that we have not been able to keep up with our projections at some stage or the other. Why did it happen? We are aware of the various relationships, and that is why it did not grow. And if it grows at the rate that we envisage, like General Roy Chaudhary said, compete and cooperate, it will certainly grow up to 100 billion someday, very soon. Sorry. Now, this is insofar as the economic factors are concerned. I have 6 minutes more to explain to you, about Uber and this thing. I would like to say a few things about Uber. Most of the commentators seem to see many implications of it. Some are just wishful, and I think many are fanciful about this Uber. The economic viability, just think of it, the economic viability of an overland route from eastern China all the way to Europe is not only questionable, the cost factor and the output, if you consider it, it will be no match to the shipping routes that we have. And if the Arctic routes are opened, I think the naval officers will be able to bear this out. It will become, the sea routes will become even much cheaper than what Uber is planned at the moment. Now, but the only major initiative is the China-Pakistan CPEC, which will link Kashgar to in Xinjiang and Gwadar in Balochistan. Both are trouble spots. How it succeeds in the long term, we'll have to wait and see. And it may well end up as another Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which lies today unused and forlorn. And I think a few days ago I read somewhere that Sri Lanka had to pick up the bill for all this. Now, let us see something about this next figure. This is a proposed South Asian Trans-Railway Corridor. Mind you, this is nothing new. And somewhere in the 40s or early 40s, before World War II, somebody had planned a Trans-European Asian Railway. Today it has improved much more. And this is a proposal from the states of Dardanelles right up to the tip of Indonesia. In 2004 beginning, India itself carried out a car rally all the way from Delhi right up to Indonesia. The roads were there, but yes, bad in patches, but it was done. And this particular route actually is following that same road. Now, what happens is this. It is estimated by 2030, Asia will account for 60% of the economy, of the GDP. I mean, we have all talked about it in the last thing. So if we are going to account for 60%, then we are going to become, Asia I mean, not India, the fulcrum of the entire economy of the world. If that is so, we need to move things from place A to place B. And this feature over land is perhaps the easiest way to do it. Just to go a little more, these are already existing railways in India, the corridor. So what you have over here actually is a already existing system. All that it needs to be done is to expand it to the various other nations, the most difficult being Bangladesh and Myanmar. They need to be but I'm sure there's enough money in the Chinese banks or Chinese initiative, so does India today, to help in this particular process. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I am talking about cooperation and competition at a later stage. This is not a matter of confrontation. I would also like to show you a slide on what is there in China, in the southern China, Kunming area. These are the Chinese railway lines. What matters over here is, whatever to be the outcome in 2050, one thing is certain, that India and China will be amongst the top 3 of the world economies. China's bilateral trade today, as I've already talked about it, and in the world it would be near 40 trillion and over 55 trillion in 2050, China's alone trade. So in effect, what we have is this railway, what is called as the Southern Star, some people call it, will become more of an Asian economic pathway, mutual prosperity, and it is important that we try and think on these lines. This is one path of cooperation which could be adopted without interfering or without subverting one's own national interest in any manner. The sea routes are too long, and the Straits of Malacca, I think, I do not know whether I am making the statement correct, but I read it somewhere, so I just jotted it down. The sea routes are too long, and the Straits of Malacca have already become increasingly difficult and expensive choke point. Unless the new Setu Samudran passage in the Park Straits can lead to a new passage, direct, cutting through the Kra Isthmus straight into the Siam Gulf. So, it's a long thought, this train system, how will it work? Maybe a stock company has to be bought up by money of all the 3 countries. But it is certainly a far better alternative. But many red tapes, many bureaucratic issues have to be overcome on this. I have finished. I will now hand over the thing to Mr. Hart.
Zero. Congratulations for presenting the paper of someone else. It's quite remarkable. So I think we have just 50 minutes because lunchtime. I think just to resume that Narayan said in the morning, and Roy Chaudhary also, and Ambassador Sinha also, that there is a mindset which has to be changed because people in China do not understand India, and vice versa, India does not understand. It's a great pity that I'm sitting here and Chinese speaker is not sitting. It doesn't help because I cannot really help in that way. So I think also the fact mentioned by Ambassador Sinha of the tourists, the Chinese tourists, 130, 140, 135 million tourists going abroad, and very few coming to India. It means there is something to change. And I think also Ambassador Sinha mentioned playing by the rules. I think I will mention it in the afternoon when I speak about the Brahmaputra. And this morning, Sri Nayanan mentioned the 2005 guidelines for sorting out the border issue. If 1 year later you decide that to claim Tawang again, that is changing the rule after finding some agreement. It has been the same thing for the agreement on the Brahmaputra, the Sutlej, or the Parichu. It has been the same thing also of the Lam incident because it came out because in 2012, both government, both diplomacies, maybe not the PA level didn't agree, but both diplomacy had agreed to keep the status quo, and suddenly it changed. So if China wants to play a role, world role, and become a world leader, it has to learn also to play by the rule. Wherever it is, you can't say South China Sea, court arbitration, I don't believe in it. If China wants really to become a world power, it has to, whether it is internal for the Indian company trying to set up, or the American company trying to set up businesses in China, or when it's international agreement like a border agreement and all. I think it's what as Mr. Xi Jinping has 5 years. I don't know what will happen, but I hope that some progress will be made in this field. I am not an expert in economy or anything, but I think I've seen that this big issue to be sorted out. Thank you so much.